So, hi everyone. Welcome to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm Sydney Yeager, the Public Programs Coordinator at the museum, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's inaugural New York Jewish Book Festival. This event is on Intimacies and Transgressions, frankly feminist short stories with Susan Weidman Schneider, Yona Zeldis McDonough, Penny Jackson, Sarah Seltzer, and Judith Zimmerman. We hope you will explore the 32 events that are happening throughout the museum today, meet some of the 85 speakers, and get books signed at one of the 72 author signings in our main lobby and events hall on the second floor. While you are here, we also encourage you to take the time to visit our exhibitions, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do on the main level, and Survivors' Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler on the third floor. Andy Goldsworthy's Garden of Stones is also worth a visit, just outside of our wonderful Cafe Locks. The whole museum is open to you today. You can also pick up holiday gifts and books at the Pickman Museum shop and visitor services on the main level. We are encouraging people to wear masks in the museum, and we hope you will share feedback with us in our post-festival survey, which will be in your inboxes tomorrow. This program is made possible in part by support from the Battery Park City Authority. Your donations also help us present these programs, and this event is co-presented by Lilith Magazine. And now I'm very glad to introduce you to our speakers. Susan Weidman Schneider, one of Lilith's founding mothers, has been editor-in-chief since the magazine launched. Her writing about Jewish women's philanthropy, the Jewish stake in abortion rights, the persistence of gender stereotyping, and more have been credited with moving the needle on feminist change in the Jewish world. She's the author of Jewish and Female and Intermarriage, and co-author of Head and Heart, a book about money in the lives of women. Yona Zeldis McDonough is the author of 7 novels for adults and 26 children's books. For over a dozen years, McDonough has been the fiction editor at Lilith Magazine, and she works independently to help aspiring writers polish their manuscripts. Penny Jackson is an award-winning novelist, playwright, and screenwriter. Her novel, Becoming the Butlers, was chosen by the New York Public Library as one of the best books for young adults. Awards for her writing include a MacDowell Colony Fellowship, the Elizabeth Janeway Prize in Writing at Barnard College, the Pushcart Prize, and the Gideon Poetry Review Prize. Her story, My Daughter's Boyfriends, was published in Lilith in spring 2021. Sarah Seltzer was named a winner of the 2013 Lilith Fiction Contest and eventually took a job at the magazine, where she now serves as executive editor. A self-described old millennial, she is working on a novel about a family of folk singers. Her story, Ironing, was published in Lilith in summer 2013. Judith Zimmer has published short fiction in 5 on the 5th, an online literary magazine. The author of several nonfiction books, she has written for the New York Times, Psychology Today, and other outlets. She lives in New York City and Connecticut and is working on a novel. Her story, Max's Mom Goes to Camp, was published in Lilith in summer 2016. Frankly Feminist Short Stories by Jewish Women from Lilith Magazine is available for purchase in our Pickman Museum shop and lobby. And the authors will sign copies for half an hour after the event in the resource area in the events hall on the second floor. Please welcome Susan Weidman Schneider, Yona Zeldis McDonough, Penny Jackson, Sarah Seltzer, and Judith Zimmer.
Thank you so much. And just to make sure that there's no confusion, although 5 authors, are we mic'd? Is this working? Is this working? Thank you. Although you heard 5 authors introduced, Penny Jackson, alas, had to call in sick this morning. So with great regret, we
soldier on.
Yes, soldier, thank you. Thank you, Des. We will bravely carry on. And her short story, My Daughter's Boyfriends, of course, is in here in Frankly Feminist. I'm going to speak a little bit. This is the order of business here, very serious. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, which I find completely enchanting, and I can say that without too much braggadocio because my writing isn't in it except for the introductions. I'm not a fiction writer. And Yona is going to read from the first and I think quite spectacular story in here. And then Sarah is going to read from Ironing, which I actually heard in the intro as irony, which I think is also fabulous. It's an alternative title, Ironing/irony. And Judith is going to read from Max's Mom Goes to Summer Camp. Mother.
Max's mom goes to camp.
Max's Mom Goes to Camp. Thank you. I've only read the story and enjoyed it about 95 times. The stories are, I think, a remarkable read in two ways. Each one is a little gem in and of itself, but also read together, they give a pretty interesting overview of what are the concerns, both from a Jewish perspective and from a feminist perspective, on gender for the last, couple of millennia at least, ranging from one Bible story, which totally reimagines the story of Lot's wife, and long before she turns into a pillar of salt, how she managed to protect her daughters from rape and set an entire village on fire. Bless her heart. And really, the stories which group themselves into categories are all transgressive. We decided today to entitle the talk Transgressions, in part because each one of these stories has its own peculiar lens on an aspect of life that is, interestingly, both feminist and Jewish, sometimes pop culture, sometimes relating to Jewish law, Jewish practice. You don't have to be Jewish to read, enjoy, and completely get each one of these stories. But as Yona and I have said, these are feminist stories because they center women. Each one has a pretty compelling voice. And they're Jewish because whether they relate to Jewish practice, there's a story about mikveh here, which is both fascinating and, yes, transgressive, and to things like sitting Shiva and certain marriage traditions, but also the sociological aspects of being Jewish in various cultures. There's the story of a woman who comes out of North Africa where she was raised in a rather patriarchal environment, and after she manages to kind of be independent as an older adult, is taken in and moved by her son, where, having once been under the thumb of her mother-in-law and her husband, then is sort of helpless again thanks to the kindness of her son wanting to respect his mother. Anyway, I won't spoil the fun. You will enjoy the book, I think, tremendously, and Yona is going to share with us a little bit about how the book was put together. And then after we have the readings, we're going to say more about the themes and the, I think, the power and the pleasure of these stories.
Good morning. Small, but hopefully interested and even passionate. So, Susan, I was trying to think when we actually got the idea for this anthology, and how it came about. But it seems to me it's been around for a long time. I have been the fiction editor of Lilith for over 20 years. Somehow the introduction didn't get that quite right. But we've been talking about it for a long time. And then it was through one of our board members that, there was a connection made with a publisher, and this dream was going to become a reality. So I had the first nitty-gritty job of going through all 45 years worth of the fiction. I read everything, including stories I'd loved and championed, and stories I possibly never read before because they were published, 20 years before I was on board, and I might not have gotten to them. I didn't read every issue cover to cover. So that was an amazing experience for me, and I felt inordinately proud of what we published, just in a kind of landscape of where short stories are in this moment. We're something of a beleaguered species. There used to be many general interest magazines and women's magazines that published them. They no longer do. And we have been publishing original fiction since the beginning, from writers of all backgrounds, ages, emerging, established. we've launched careers of several writers, which I feel very proud about. And I just think we are doing an important thing, really, and I love being a part of it. So my original reading, I put together a list of 80 stories, 80 that I loved, that like made my little heart beat faster. And, you know, I brought this to Susan and she said, there can't be 80 in the collection. We knew there couldn't be 80. So with great regret, I had to winnow, and we got it down to, what are we, 43 or 44? I never quite remember that. And I think they are a good representation of our range, our scope, where we've been, where we're going. There are stories that reflect changes. I think we've talked about that. I used to see a lot of ancestor worship, a particular kind of Jewish grandmother, mother that was evoked. And I see that less now because, you know, people have changed. Times have moved on. Those grandmothers are gone. So I don't see as much of that. We saw a lot of midrash. That's kind of a perennial thing. Always relationships. And as Susan said, always women front and center. Women as subjects, not as objects. That's kind of my criteria for looking at a story. Like the woman has to be, you know, have some agency in her life. And I guess the other thing I want to say is also the wide spectrum of what it means to be Jewish, because it isn't only one thing. We have stories about women who are deeply observant and, you know, very well situated within the traditional culture, and women who are not, women who are more assimilated, women who come up against, you know, I call it the intersection of Jewish and Gentile, because we still are, for all that we're told, you know, we control everything and that we're everywhere, we still are a minority. And, you know, we're not the default position in the West. Christianity is the default position. And so this is something I just feel in my own life, and I see it in the stories. Like, how do we navigate that space? You know, we're Jews. We know we're Jews. We want to be Jews, but like, where are we in the wider world? So that's kind of been my story with this, and it's been a great one. And we feel so proud of this book. We really do.
And I think the diversity of the voices is pretty striking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we had in mind as we were making the selections, that there are people of, we said in one of the lines we created for the publisher, these are people of wildly different backgrounds and eras and very different perspectives. So ranging from the voice of a young teenager in Sarah's story, the older Moroccan woman I mentioned, and the story that I think you're going to read for us now, which is taking place in the womb, right?
An unusual perspective.
Right.
And Susan, do you want to say who wrote it and what the...
This is a story by Esther Singer Kreitman, the forgotten and now still to be fully resurrected sister of Isaac Bashevis Singer, Nobel Prize winning writer in Yiddish and in English, and sister also of I.J. Singer, author of The Brothers Ashkenazi, and so on. I mean, hugely important and prominent writing family. Esther Singer Kreitman, the older sister of those guys, was also a writer. She wrote prolifically as a young person. Her mother destroyed, thank you very much, her early writing, having alerted her daughter to the fact that if people got wind of this particular talent, it would render her unmarriageable. She subsequently married. She subsequently wrote more. She has a novel called Esther, and this was one of her early stories. You'll hear how powerful it is, and it taps into a certain misogyny that I think is characteristically Jewish. I hate to say it, but we know much in Jewish life and practice is patriarchal, some say misogynistic, and this was a family that really was not happy to have had a firstborn daughter, someone who would not be able to say Kaddish for the parents, somebody who would not be, a respected learner carrying on the family tradition, and so on.
And the name.
And the name.
So here's Esther, the New World. I'm just going to read a little bit of it. Maybe stop me when we're, okay. From the start, I didn't like lying in my mother's belly. Enough. When it got warm, I twisted around, curled up, and lay still. But 5 months later, when I felt alive, I was really very unhappy, fed up with the whole thing. It was especially tiresome lying in the dark all the time, and I protested. But who heard me? I didn't know how to shout. One day, I wondered if perhaps that wasn't how to do it, and I started looking for a way out. I just wanted to get out. After pondering a long time, it occurred to me, oh, should I be doing this? Yes.
Maybe hold.
Okay, no, I think I can do it. It occurred to me that the best idea would be to start fighting with my mama. I began throwing myself around, turning cartwheels, often jabbing her in the side. I didn't let up, but it didn't do any good. I simply gave myself a bad name so that when, for instance, I'd grow tired of lying on one side and try turning over just to make myself a little more comfortable, she'd start complaining. In short, why should I lie here cooking up something? It didn't do any good. I had to lie there the whole 9 months. Understand? The whole period. Well, not having any other choice, I consoled myself. I'll simply start later. Just as soon as they let me out into God's world, I'll know what I have to do. Of course, I'll be an honored guest. I have a lot of reasons to think so. First of all, because of what I often heard my mama tell some woman who, as I later found out, was my grandma. Grandma comes in and smiles at Mama. She looks happy, probably because her daughter has come through it all right. She doesn't even look at me. Mazel tov, dear daughter. Mazel tov, may we enjoy good fortune. Mama smiles too, but not at me. Of course, I would have been happier if it were a boy, says Mama. Grandma winks roguishly with a half-closed eye and consoles her. No problem, boys will also come. I listen to all that, and it is very sad for me to be alive. How come I was born if all the joy wasn't because of me? I'm already bored to death. Oh, how I want to go back to the other world. All of a sudden, I feel strange cold over my body. I am jolted out of my thoughts. I feel myself clamped in 2 big, plump hands, which pick me up. I shake all over. Could it be? A dreadful idea occurs to me. Is she going to stuff me back for another 9 months? Brr, I shudder at the very thought. But as my head spins, everything is whirling before my eyes. I feel completely wet, tiny as I am. Am I in a stream? But a stream is cool, pleasant, even nice. But this doesn't interest me as much as the idea of what the 2 big, clumsy hands want to do with me. I am completely at their mercy. It does hurt a little, but I almost don't feel it, Mama would say. I'm glad. I was so scared I was barren. A trifle, it's already 2 years since the wedding, and you don't see or hear anything. Minka, the barren woman, also said she would yet have children, and why should I be sure of it? Well, praised be the one who survives. With God's help, it will come out all right. God forbid with no evil eye. Grandma would always answer. From such conversations, I assumed I would be a welcome guest. I knew that here in the other world, where I lived ever since I became a soul, when an important person came, he was supposed to be greeted with great fanfare. First of all, a bright light was to be spread over the whole sky. Angels waiting for him were to fly around, merry, beautiful cherubs who spread such holy joy that the person only regretted he hadn't died sooner. It was quite a novelty that I, an honored, a long-awaited guest, expected to be born into a big light home with open windows where the sun would illuminate everything with a bright light. Every morning, I waited for birds who were supposed to come greet me, sing me a song. And I was supposed to be born on the 1st of Adar, a month of joy. When Adar begins, people are merry. But right here it comes, the first disappointment. And we hope you'll read more of this story and find out about subsequent disappointments. Quite a point of view in utero.
Gets me every time. And from that, moving from the uterus to what happens. A very different point of view, and Sarah's story written more than 100 years. Well, about when we first published The New World, the Esther Singer Crichton story, it was on the 100th anniversary of her birth, and Sarah's story was written more than 100 years after this one. So, Sarah Seltzer, take it away.
So from the womb to teen angst, or preteen angst, I should say. This story is called Ironing, and I kind of recently, as I revisited it for this book, remembered that, you know, in my MFA program, everyone was always reading Joyce, and we were obsessed with Dubliners as like the model for short stories, and the story Araby, which is this very famous story that everyone reads in school, and then again in their MFA programs, is about a young boy's journey to try to impress a girl. And the seed of this story was planted by that, because I was like, well, what would a female journey look like? And it would be, you know, he wants to buy something fancy for her, and he ends up very disappointed. Like, nothing lives up to his imagination. And for a girl, my thought was that the journey wouldn't be to buy something fancy, but it would be to change herself for the male gaze, for the world. And this story is a lot funnier and sort of sillier than Joyce, but that was the impetus. So I'm just going to read the very beginning. Esther watched Tennis Boy amble across the hotel lobby, racket slung across his back, and decided on the spot he'd be her very first boyfriend. He wasn't noticeably handsome, but he was noticeably normal, and to Esther, that was everything. The mirrors on the wall created 4 of him, no 6, each more polished than the last. Esther's own family needed no multiplying, boisterous and too many already. They monopolized the desk as they checked in for their reunion in Puerto Rico, her uncle passing out room keys like prizes. Given that Tennis Boy would be gallivanting past at regular intervals, he was an obvious choice. He would fall for Esther's wholesome looks, a contrast to the gussied-up falseness of the girls back home. He and she would dive beneath the same surging wave, impressed by her courage when she rose in the surf's wake. He'd compliment her. Then, as the sun sent light skittering across the turquoise water, he'd kiss her. Esther would soon be transported by a momentous passion, leaving behind her squabbling family, the impending double doom of braces and a bat mitzvah, and the fact that her best friend Lynn had a date to the winter formal and she didn't. And the terror that underlay all of this, a sense that each day since 7th grade began had colluded with the day before it to shove Esther further into a crouch, to render her one day less free. Unfortunately for Esther's plans, the hotel's beach was lake-like. There were no waves. Even worse, the air above it was what the girls at school called bad hair day air. Though she'd ignored her cousin's request to build a sand fort so she could recline beneath the umbrella and alternate reading a Star Trek novel, with conjuring Tennis Boy's lips brushing hers, her curls still began to bloat. Her cousins gave her a new nickname. After the expanding animals on TV infomercials, those hideously mushrooming balls of greenery. You know what Esty looks like? A chia pet. They sat at dinner at the resort's mediocre Italian restaurant, all in polo shirts. She'd already slathered in gobs of her brother's gel, so much that her scalp itched. But LA Style 100 Extra Hold had failed. Chia pet. Her brother's shoulders churned up and down with mirth. The adults gulped their amusement back, their throats constricting. Esther's mother, whose hair was cut close to her skull, ran a hand through the girl's locks, but was halted by thick, gel-caked snarls. Like me, she said softly. Like your whole family. Her aunts, not Jewish, denied involvement in the travesty of Esther's hair. Esther, honey, don't butter the bread. You're not getting taller. Well, she's certainly sprouting, said her uncle, and everyone laughed because Esther was a noticeable B-cup, which was something for a 12-year-old girl. Not that it sent the boys running in her direction yet. She had heard her father telling her aunt on the tarmac this morning, adding, thank God. Esther, who had been attempting to be a good sport at dinner, wondered suddenly what kept the boys from running in her direction. Did she want them to run in her direction?
She squeezed a spongy curl, felt it rebound, and fantasized about impaling her entire family with a butter knife, then stabbing herself in the heart. Tennis boy and his family emerged from a corner table. Esther thrust her shoulders back and offered him a bold, natural gaze, which he neither noticed nor returned. Yet he beckoned her into a much better daydream. Her t-shirt morphed into an evening dress. Her hair softened and spread like wings, and together they danced until dawn to Caribbean drums. She buttered her bread and floated away.
Love it. You have to read the whole story.
And I don't know if it was mentioned, but that this was a winner. Yeah, yes, it was. Okay.
And, since nobody ever leaves Lilith, as your bio mentioned.
Yeah.
Judith, so now taking the drama of women's lives. The first section of the book is entitled the Transitions and starts with the New World and works itself through various life stages. So the stage that Judith is reading about really is about fledging a young adult child. And unlike birds who get fledged when they fly off and that's about it, maybe there's a reunion when they fly south for the winter. Fledging human adults is much more of a start and stop operation. I can testify to that, but children well beyond the summer camp stage themselves. So Judith is going to read from Max's Mom Goes to Camp.
That's right. My story begins with a quote from, right, thanks. You want me to hold? Yeah, if you don't mind. Thanks. From Scholom's On the Kabbalah and Its Symbolism. Tzimtzum, contraction, ushers in the cosmic drama, for it is God's withdrawal that first creates space. Every mile of the drive from West 22nd Street to Hancock had felt right. How good it was to say the words to anyone who crossed her path that morning. I'm going to visit my son. In her mind, she and Max were one big family, even though now it was just the two of them. Hers was a life wiped out by divorce. It was a miracle, really, that she'd even had Max in the first place, let alone gotten any other children out of his father. One loss is not another, her therapist said. The wooden signs nailed to trees said, blind curve, honk your horn, and children on bikes. It was the Saturday morning of Parents' Weekend, and the parking lot was full. She saw couples and dogs getting out of cars, strolling toward the main campgrounds. She felt a little out of place since she wasn't officially here for Parents' Weekend, even though it was when they told the parents of counselors to visit. Out of the car, she took a long breath, inhaling the cool and fragrant Vermont air, so different from home. She reached the end of the path and the camp lay before her. Rustic red log cabins, a big stone building with a wraparound porch, open fields leading to a lake. The lawn might have been a jumble of ages and activities, but everyone looked like they knew where they were going and what they were doing. Children careened across the grass on bikes. They gathered in bunches on the lawn or walked in pairs and threesomes toward the main building, some holding hands without giving it a thought. Across the lawn, from the swings to the hammocks to the tetherball poles, she caught glimpses of movement and color, a Georges Seurat come to life. You could see that it wasn't one of those glossy brochure-type camps. It was, as Max had described it, low-key and not competitive. And everyone's a winner kind of place. No homesickness apparent here, she thought. Strange, really, that she'd never sent Max away to sleepaway camp when he was young. Had he missed out? A few parents milled around on the path in front of her, and they looked content too, greeting their children, getting ready to join an activity, weighing the prospects of crafts or tennis or rowing. There must be some camp schedule they all just knew. She seemed to be the only newcomer, the only one who didn't know the ropes. Could she also be the only parent who had come alone? She counted heads. She did this wherever she went. She was always on the lookout for other single moms at restaurants, on the street, in the park. Seeing other single parents made her feel that she wasn't the only one raising a child this way. As she approached the first log cabin, a young woman leaned out of the doorway. "Can I help?" "I'm looking for Max Durbin. I'm his mother." "Oh, hi, Mrs. Durbin. I just saw Max." She hadn't been called Mrs. Durbin in a while, and there was that moment where it felt wrong to even claim it as her name. There was another Mrs. Durbin now, This was one of those things you couldn't possibly plan for when you married and kept your maiden name, that one day another woman would have the same last name as your son, but you wouldn't. Mrs. Durbin, you can wait here. I'll have someone get him for you. A few minutes later, someone shouted, "There's Max." And there he was, all 6'3" of him, swooping down on a bicycle, toothbrush and razor in a net bag hanging from the handlebars, wearing flannel pajama bottoms and looking sleepy. His brown hair stood up straight, as though it just woke up too. At 5'11", she wasn't short, but Max hung over her like a giant sunflower. She gazed up, squinting to see his face. He bent down so she could kiss the top of his head, the woodsy country smell of his hair. "You're early," he said. "I was just getting ready." "No problem. I'll wait. Give me 5." And he took off on the bike, leaving her on the path. She watched him go. Why the flannel pajamas? Not a good sign. They reminded her of his senior year in high school when Max wore pajama bottoms all the time and talked like an anarchist about how grades didn't matter. Then freshman year in college, Max had been recruited to play baseball but never showed up at practice. What's the point anyway? She'd had to answer the coach's concerned calls, the patient ones, the indignant one. She didn't really know why he'd stopped baseball after all those years, except that he'd started reading philosophy. But she knew that it was a Division III school and he hadn't signed a contract. He had simply walked away from a game he loved, and as people were always saying, his incredible talent. He just doesn't need baseball anymore, one of her friends said. But he'd ended his freshman year on every probation form they had. Too much partying, missed classes, bad grades. He had to see a counselor. Now he was considering not going back, which made her crazy with anxiety. What would he do with himself? He'd get off track. She'd get off track. His father would see it as a failure. So would her parents. She'd get blamed. He's dropping out. He's a dropout. Where she came from, school was the most important thing. It was a bad idea to deviate from the 4-year plan. If you did, you got lost. You were a loser, and so was your mother. A bell rang, and now there were even more kids walking between buildings, mingling on the lawn, shouting to one another. She wanted to take in as much of the place as she could, the better to understand what Max was doing here. And then there he was again, back on the bike, this time wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and it looked like he'd washed his face. He had only 2 free periods this morning, and they had arranged to go out for breakfast in town. At the cafe, they settled at a table outside, overlooking the main street. She was eager to hear from him. She was overly aware of the time, that they didn't have much. How was it all going? Did he like it? What was his actual job, duties? What was the schedule? How was Emily, the girl who had gotten him the job? "Whoa, Mom, slow down," he said. "You're asking too many questions. It's like you're a mosquito buzzing around me." And he made a shooing motion with his hand. She sat back in her chair, looked out at the street, willed herself not to tear up. She knew she buzzed. She could feel herself buzzing. She buzzed because there was just Max. She would have never spoken to her own parents that way. She wouldn't have dared. Even now with her parents, it was a one-way street. They spoke, she nodded. She'd never been able to say what she meant. Half the time she had to settle for the surface, the buried words too hard to retrieve. She was untrained, but not Max. She'd given her child that at least. Do you want me to keep going?
Why don't you read another couple
Okay,
paragraphs?
sure. She took an intentionally long sip of iced coffee, hoping that the silence wouldn't go unnoticed. They were both quiet. She hated quiet. She looked out past him to the town's main drag, a hardware store and laundromat across the street. What would it be like to live here? "Sorry, Mom, but it's true." "I know," she smiled, "but I haven't seen you in so long. I need to know how you're doing." The food came. Max was hungry and dug into his omelet and home fries. "That looks good. I order this every time I come here." The food lightened him up. Each bite was a huge forkful. "So, I've got this bunk of 13-year-olds, he said. "I got them because I'm taller than all the other counselors and it's the only cabin I fit into." And she thought, really? They put you in charge of teenagers? Who would have thought that an anarchist could take charge of a group of 13-year-olds? That seems like a good spot.
Thank you.
Oh, right.
Well, it would be great, I think, to hear a little bit about each of the stories. And Yona, you didn't get to read from your own, which is pretty fascinating. Again, a different setting in the 1940s, 30s in Detroit.
In Detroit. Well, what I didn't say is, like Susan mentioned, No One Lose Love. I came to Lilith first having been a writer. My stories were published there. And so, and then essays, and then I developed a relationship with editors there. And when the fiction editor's job came open, I applied for it. And I've been there ever since. So there is that trajectory often, that those who come to Lilith do not leave Lilith. We stay.
The fact that your shoes were nailed to the ground. So, because you can't speak to what the drive was to create the Esther Singer Kreitman story, maybe think about your story, Gide, which is
Which
another.
Susan named. I have to say she's the title queen. She
We
always comes up
divide.
with her
This is like divide and conquer. Yona has eclept me, the title maven, and the story of Yona's, interestingly and appropriately, comes in a section called. I'll tell you the titles of the different sections of the book. As I mentioned, that Transitions, which we've heard from, is followed by a section entitled Intimacies. And the intimacies are, some of them romantic relationships, and some of them are through a prism of women's friendships or non-friendships, a different kind of intimacy. One is a short story by Jane Lazar, At the Connecticut Shore, which is about a Jewish woman in 1919 who is drawn to a black man who is married happily to a woman who cuts hair. And the protagonist goes to have her hair cut by the woman married to a man she has her eye on. And it gives you an awful lot of insight into the potential both for friendship and disaster in this hair cutting scene. And of course, it's so intimate to have one's hair cut, have your body touched in any way by someone else. You know, the scene where the mother of your protagonist puts her hands through and gets her hand caught in a tangle of gelled curls. All of these body-related moments. The next section, Transgressions, is where Yona's short story Gide occurs. Gide is an impolite word in Russian and Ukrainian for Jew, and I think in other Slavic languages also. The fourth section is war. A reviewer said, I don't like war stories, so I'm glad there are only 4 in here. Okay, well, there's a frankly feminist, but there's a frank review. And then comes Body and Soul. I mean, you've already heard how much is really embodied in all of these stories. But Body and Soul has to do, again, with what goes on at that intersection of Jewish and feminist as we think about our bodies and other people's bodies, and that's where Sarah's story appears. And there's also a quite wonderful story in there of having children, choosing not to have children. Issues around fertility and infertility loom large for Jews. The first injunction in the Bible is to be fruitful and multiply, and that comes with its own sets of expectations and challenges. And it's different in some ways through the lives of Jewish women or women who've been raised in a culture where that primacy of children is either something you accept or something you have to challenge, you have to fight against. Then a section, the concluding section, To Belong. And as you said, Yona, a couple minutes ago, that when we're Jewish, there's always this insider-outsider status. What is it like to be a culture on the periphery? To be able to have that sort of doubleness of vision. You're a participant and you are an observer, sort of like a good anthropologist. And in a way, that's what it is like to be a Jew in a culture where you are clearly, as you said, not the majority. And the concluding story, which is in that section, which is actually, I think, hilariously funny, and I will not spoil the many punchlines, is by Naomi Seidman, who's a scholar and an author of fiction and nonfiction, and it's entitled Raised by Jews. So with that, Sarah, do you want to say something about you did a little bit about your MFA program and reading Joyce and the inspiration for writing under the male gaze?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about sort of like Jewish feminist writing and like how my fiction, like naturally kind of falls into that category. But also I think I knew that this story was gonna, like, I just had it in mind for Lilith, like as I was writing it. And I actually workshopped it. I mean, the Lilith world is so small.
I workshopped it in Diana Speckler's living room, and she's another author in the anthology. But I just think, Jewish hair is just like a perennial. I was just thinking about how my son, who's 6, hates having his hair touched. He's like one of those kids who's really sensitive about like hair, and he won't get his hair cut and stuff. And so it's now become a struggle between me and him. And like I'm the mother. Like I have to spray the detangler in, and because he wakes up with like matted hair in the morning, and the struggle continues. Even as I've come to accept, I love my hair now, and the hair hatred that I felt at like 12 and 13, which my mother, who was here, was very sympathetic about, and not mean like the relatives in the story, but she helped me conquer my hair struggles. But it continues because like hair is a major way of, speaking of insider outsider, of like signaling conformity, right? So like you just straighten your hair is to conform, to iron your hair is to conform. And this is like a huge issue in communities of color, in immigrant communities. And it was I went to a school with a lot of Jewish kids in New York City, and this was like a huge like marker of status and like where you were in terms of your journey. Like if someone came in and had her hair relaxed and gotten like the Brazilian treatment or whatever, like that meant like she was making a play for, to like be accepted in a different way. And people, and then when you as you got older in high school and more people let their hair go curly, it was like a sign of sort of becoming more comfortable with yourself. So it was like very like the politics of hair were really interesting. And it almost feels now as an adult like a lost world, because like now, having sort of somewhat wild or bushy hair is not as, shameful. Like society has changed that way, I think, but probably not for 12-year-olds. So,
But here's a question for you. I mean, would you ever write about hair as nonfiction? I feel like I got it all out in this story. I really feel like it's all in there. I think it could show up in an essay. It could, it is interesting. It always is interesting. And the thing about this story is people have come up to me like for years and said like, I was that girl. Like that was me. Like I had, and I was like, well, it was me too. I mean, it was, it really resonates for people. People have a lot of anxiety, and I think like the hair is symbolic, right? It could be any kind of part. It could be your nose, like it could be any part of your body, or your boobs, like any part of your body that you feel doesn't fit in and you want to change, or like the girls in Judy Blume who are like trying to make their boobs bigger with like their exercises. I think there's going to be a movie of Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret coming out this year. And so we'll see that. Or like, 8-minute abs, like, whatever it is, like, whether it's, trying to do like Jane Fonda's workout video or get your hair ironed, like it's about that period in your life where you're just trying to fit in.
It's
So,
more than one period
yeah.
in your life.
Yes.
I think. This goes on
Yeah.
and on. It's amazing. When we did a cover story at Lilith years ago, must be easily 20 years ago, and we tend to have, and there are copies of the magazine here for you to take, please. We tend not to focus a huge section of the features on a single topic, just because there is so much going on in the world, and we offer our readers, and the readers are, as diverse as the writers. But we decided to run 20 pages on hair. The cover read, Jewish hair, 20 pages on sex, shame, guilt, transgression, a string of maybe a dozen nouns all about hair. And the issue of the magazine was a big hit. Telephone rang in the Lilith office. I was getting a call from an editor at Glamour who said to me, you've done a fascinating issue on Jewish hair. You know, will you send over, please? Can you send over a couple dozen copies? And I said, look, I'm really sorry, the issue sold out. And there's like a beat on the phone, pause. She said, don't you know that when you put hair on the cover, it sells out? And then I don't know. After, we've been publishing 20, 25 years. We never put hair on the cover before. And then the first issue that we published during the pandemic
was another hair issue.
And it also did very well. I think that when we are being honest about these issues around not only body, but the things that are on our minds that we don't always speak about. It's no accident that this book is entitled Frankly Feminist. And the magazine's tagline is Independent, Jewish, and Frankly Feminist.
Judith, I'm sorry, I missed the issues on hair. I'll look them up for sure. My story is pretty autobiographical, this particular short story. And so the question comes up, maybe you face this sometimes, should this be memoir or should it be fiction? And I feel like it worked as a short story and as fiction for me because I could get so inside the character in a way I doubt I would have if it had been nonfiction and memoir. It's always an issue. Not all my writing is as autobiographical as this, but something similar happened to me, and I published this years ago, and I still have parents who come up to me and say, I experienced this. I keep reading your story. I just sent my kid to college. They go through it. It's you'll read the story, I hope, but it's in a way it's about the parent letting go. So,
and they come to you and say, I am that parent. They come to Sarah and say, right, I am that 12-year-old.
And Judith, I noticed about this, Max's mom doesn't get a name in the story. Yeah. She's Max's mom. Right. Like that's her identity in her head. Like that's how she's thinking of herself, and that's where she's positioned herself. And whatever name she has, we never know it. Yeah. Other name,
Right. There was a while I was writing a series of short stories about
Max's mom.
And
send them to me. I want to read them.
Does she get a name?
She does have a name in another story.
I'm gonna feel
right.
better.
But I'm not working on that anymore. But thank you. But I did say to Yona that just reading this volume, and I read all of it, it just inspired me to write another short story. I was thinking, what's not here? What could I fill in? What was I expecting? So thank you for inspiring me.
Despite the great diversity of voices and perspectives here, these stories cover a span of 45 years. And so, if there is a volume 2, picking up where this one leaves off, which was about 2 years ago, I think over the next few years, we're going to be seeing more LGBTQ voices. We're going to see far more writing from people who are exploring aspects of a multifaceted Jewish and feminist heritage. Lots is coming to the surface now.
Gender, new understanding of that.
Sure. And some of these stories touch upon that already. Penny Jackson's, for example.
And as long as we're here, I do have this plug I can offer. If you are writing stories that you think would be suitable for Lilith, I see somebody, send them to us. Send them to me. I read them. I read them very quickly. In fact, sometimes I am chastised for reading them too quickly because people think am I on? I can't tell. People think that I'm not taking them seriously enough. They're wrong. It's because I'm so happy to get one, and it comes into my personal email, and I don't want it to slide down on the queue and miss it. So I read it quickly if I have the time. So send us your stories. Okay, we'll do this. Okay, please. And I'm admiring your gorgeous eggplant-colored velvet. Beautiful color.
Yona's fiction and her new novel, which she's going to be speaking about.
Under another name at 11
soon.
o'clock.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I have a pen name.
Is full of wonderful comments on clothing. Are there comments or questions?
I do. In your story, I just was wondering, do you have something against flannel?
Oh,
Because,
oh
you
no.
know-
Oh, I see. I see. Well, no, not at all. But when you have a kid who's a teenager, college age, and he's wearing pajama bottoms all the time, you get worried. I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't even think of you look wonderful in your flannel top. It's perfectly appropriate. But no, it's when you're watching your kid and they're,
Yeah.
being a little off, and they're also not really dressing every day. You
I just wanted to make a joke because
That
I
was a
am
good
flannel,
joke,
and
yes.
that perked up my ears
Yeah.
in the story.
Okay. Well,
I do
thank you.
apologize for the very silly question.
That's all right.
Well, as we know, self-presentation is part of the deal. What's going on inside, what's going on outside, sometimes they don't match. You know, who are we when we get dressed in the morning? There was actually another another issue that did very well at Lilith was one that talked about how do feminists dress. All of those subjects are evergreen. You know, no matter how the wheel turns and we feel we're entering a different era of perception, or our eyes are kind of unsealed and we understand more about the male gaze and we understand more about what we're signaling by our choices to dress. I dress in honor of Yona, actually. Right, as
Have a
well
lot
we
of them.
should.
And keep buying more.
Right. But yes, I mean, all of this is a signifier. You know, the choices we make, the choices we decide to elide, not to make, to slide over. Other thoughts, other questions? Well, I hope that you will, of course, buy the book, enjoy the book upstairs at the Lilith magazine display in the exhibit hall is wonderful Lilith swag, by the way. Sarah might even have an example right here. And some great giveaways, right? Wonderful giveaways upstairs and copies of the magazine for you here. And also, in a shameless pitch, we have to say, this book makes the most fabulous Hanukkah gift or host gift or holiday gift of any sort, or birthday gift for feminists of any age. So we hope you will, comply with that injunction. Yona, is there more that you would like to say, either about your story in this or about the book itself?
Oh, well, I didn't say anything about my story. I didn't read it. I didn't read from it because we wanted to have Esther's voice here. But what can I say about that story? It was a story that I had heard from my grandmother, who was not a nice woman, kind of an awful woman, angry, hysterical, grudge holding. And I did not get along with her. And I don't think she much liked me. And then when she died, I was overwhelmed by grief and really surprised, like, where was that coming from? And so I started writing about her, and writing about her in a way that I hoped gave her the kind of dignity and agency that I seemed unable to give her in life. And it was kind of an apology. So that was one of those stories. I have several of them, and that was one that appeared in Lilith some years ago.
And you honor her very well. There is an extremely strong, tough story.
She was fierce.
Of a woman who sort of tricks an anti-Semite and rescues a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
Quite remarkable, as all the stories are, I have to tell you, to conclude where I began, which is that I love reading and rereading these stories. So thank you so much for your fabulous writing, for being part of the book, and thank you all for listening to us enjoy one another's voices.